the 18th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says, and will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them, and yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Okay, now that you've heard the text, you know how the lawyer joke started, don't you? Here's his description. He neither feared God nor had any respect for people. I'm kind of grateful that Rich Woodhoff isn't here this morning. And also, his opponent is probably the diametrically opposite person you could deal with, because we're dealing here with a widow. And we know from the time when Jesus walked the earth that it was a precarious time for anybody who was a widow. And in this case, it sounds as if she had to go to a lawyer, because as a widow, she doesn't seem to have any family to support her, primarily a son or an uncle, because it's usually the male that has to come to the defense. And if you're in that position, you are in a position of becoming a beggar. That is what happens to widows or orphans. And so it is said that she goes to this so-called lawyer, and she pleads her cause. And chances are what he's doing, or what she's doing, is not so much to his office, but where he lives. And you can almost see that it's an inopportune time in which she does this. And it's so interesting because I love the translation that is really quite incorrect, where the lawyer says, "I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." It sounds as if he just couldn't take it any longer, but the really best translation of that is not wearing him out, but it should say, "Lest she give me a black eye." Now this sounds like this old widow is going to hit him, but that's not even the context of what it meant in the original Greek. It simply meant that by her continuousness out there, people were beginning to notice. And he's worried about his clientele. And how nasty can you get but to deny justice to a poor widow? So he's more really interested in making money. And so he makes this decision simply because she won't stop. And as Jesus starts it off, he says to pray always and don't lose heart. And that's one of the easiest things to do, I think, especially in our everyday life. And I'm reading, for example, of the buildup of what Vladimir Putin is doing over in Russia. And it's getting a little bit scary. And if you look at all the various things that he's up to, we're thinking to myself, aha, we live in a dangerous world. Yes, we do. And I think we actually do. And so we're going to depend upon the government to do something. And I heard via the grapevine on TV that the CIA, and I love how they let you know about this, is planning retribution in terms of the internet. And they even are hinting at the fact that there you have very nasty ways of doing things over there that could really cause a lot of havoc. It becomes tit for tat, you see, because we have two warring tribes against each other. But in every day, that type of stuff, we kind of depend upon the government to take care of that for us. So our concept of what is just and what is unjust kind of filters down to our everyday life of where we live. And I find it also interesting in the last 20 years since the advent of DNA and discovering How many people are being sprung from jail for not doing things for which they were convicted? And every once in a while I will see on television a man who just recently was in jail for 20 years for a crime he did not commit. And as I sat there and I watched this man, he obviously was very happy in getting out, but I thought, how do you keep from becoming outraged at what has happened to you? And in his own mind he said, I'm just happy I'm out. But I don't know what it is to live day after day in a jail being convicted for something I didn't do. So justice is one of those things that is imperfect. We see the seal of justice, the woman who is got a blindfold on, scale in one hand, and she's holding it up, and justice is supposed to be blind. But what we discover is it is not always blind. And so when we pray for justice, and I think oftentimes we ought to really pray for all our judicial areas, whether they be state or federal or local, because oftentimes, you see, unless you really have the proper support, it doesn't go your way. And there's no question, you see, that the poor get the least amount of proper justice because they can't afford the cost of their own lawyer. A court-appointed lawyer is given, and I have been in that situation to watch that happen twice. And the court-appointed lawyer is loaded with these type of cases. He barely, or she barely, has any time to figure out what's going on. They rush into the court and they're opening their papers, trying desperately to recount in their minds, how do I defend this person? And they're loaded. They have countless cases on their back. So when we say justice is blind, it is supposed to be blind, but it never always is. There's something that is caught up in the brokenness of our own being, in the brokenness of who's going to win, in the brokenness of the rich over and against the poor. And what we hear is that same rich and poor story being fleshed out in the gospel this morning. The lawyer obviously has the money. The widow has nothing. And so when we consider what the story is trying to tell us this morning, it behooves us really very carefully. When we say our prayers of the faithful here, and we come across those type of prayers that pray for our leaders in government, pray for the people who have to administer justice. And I recall just 6 months ago talking to a man who is a judge. And I said to him, what is it like to have to pass sentence upon what you hear? And he said, it's terrible. Oftentimes lawyers want to become a judge, and he said, they don't know what they're asking for. And he said, I can't tell you how many times I will make a judgment, and then that night I will lie in bed saying, did I do the right thing? That there's somehow in this person a sense of ethicness and morality that calls into his own mind, have I done the right thing? And those are the type of people we pray who do become judges. Not those who you see who are adamant that they're always right, but those who have doubts, even when they have to pass judgment on an individual person. And that comes right down even to our own lives, doesn't it? Because we have to practice justice in how we treat one another, how we are careful. The most probably sin against justice in our own lives, I would think, is gossip. Because we take hold of stories, and sometimes we just pass them along without thinking, and they may not be true. And they can destroy people's lives, and it has happened. So when we treat each other, I think with the possibility of loving mercy before we pass the judgment, then that whole statement out front of us when we walk in here starts to make sense. There is a balance, you see, behind this whole idea of justice, whether like this woman who demands it and embarrasses the lawyer, or right down into our individual way in which we treat each other. Do we treat each other justly? And I think that can happen, you see, because the next statement, to love mercy, becomes blended with it. And when we think to ourselves, I am called in Jesus' resurrection to practice mercy. And if that comes first, then we're careful about how justice feels in our minds, what we give it to each other. And those are called the little justices. They never get to court, do they? They're part of the way we live our lives every day, giving each other justice that is tempered by that type of loving mercy. And then when that all comes together, and it takes a lot of practice, certainly it does, then the possibility of walking humbly with God becomes true, because his justice is always tempered by this type of mercy. And by God, we need that in our lives. You just did it. I just did it when we opened up the service. The confession of sins, the forgiveness, the request of it. We always have that feeling that no matter what, yeah, God's going to do it. We just kind of take that for granted. But the real question is, now do we take that and throw it out into the world? And when we do, everything else makes sense. It won't be easy. And especially among ourselves when we hear of great crimes that are done and we are outraged and we want that system of justice to come down and hammer that person. I remember once, I think it was 3 years ago, about this man who murdered a 9-year-old little girl and threw her into a grave. And when they found her, of course, she had died, but they proved that when he buried her, she was still breathing. And I looked at that and I thought, I want to tear you apart. And all of a sudden, in that frame of mind, because I have children, I have grandchildren, I could see them in that whole situation. And after I was thinking about it, I said, the real terrible thing about this crime, my demand for justice, is I want to tear him apart, which is to say, I'm going to become him. And then all of a sudden you realize you're not maybe all that better or all that worse than this horrible person, because his sin has brought out in you your desire to get retribution. And what you see, I want to bypass the court system. I don't want anybody to spend money on this guy. I don't want him to be judged guilty and thrown into jail and said, oh, you're going to get the death sentence. And I don't want to see or feed him for the next 15 years by the time all of his other courts come to date, and when he tries to wiggle out of it. I don't want it. Because I don't want it, I start to steel myself, and all of a sudden my justice that I give to other people starts to kind of wane. To be touched by sin is also to become sinful yourself before you even know what happens. So it's kind of a delicate issue, isn't it, this whole idea, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. About this judge who says, she's giving me a black eye, she's ruining my business. Okay, I'll take your case. Not because I think you're guilty or innocent, because of my own needs and my own want. She becomes the winner, thank goodness. But at the very end, when Jesus says, keep it up. And he said, and when the Son of Man comes, he asks this question, will he find faith on earth? And what is he talking about with this faith on earth, other than the people who grab hold of that God, understand that there is justice and mercy, and try to throw it out into the world. And that's what real faith is all about, because if you're going to cling to this type of God, who, for all of the Old Testament and the New, calls us to be just people, then we have to simply say, despite the struggle, this is what I am called to do. As Jesus said, well, you're the servants, that's what I've called you to do, so now I expect you to kind of get into it and practice it. It won't be easy. We all know it's going to be easy. I had to face that looking at that horrible story of that little girl, because all of a sudden, in all of that stuff, I began to realize I wasn't far away from that other man's humanity. I don't know what I would have done if I had to face him alone in a room with my outrage. I would deny him the type of justice that our whole government is set up to give. I would bypass it. And that, of course, is exactly what happens in the old days when there were lynchings and all of those wonderful things of the past, when you could bypass justice simply because you didn't particularly like the race that the other person belonged to. You see how easy it is to fall into that. And it's also very easy right about now, especially when we are falling into the difficulty of the whole people trying to get out of horrible places, immigrants. And I don't know the answer to that, and I hear both sides of the story, and I don't know where it's going to go. And I doubt very much if any of us know what to go, given we have no idea who's going to be elected president and what their platform is going to be. But I do know this. an awful lot of people who would simply want to get in. And it's possible that some of them aren't good people, but at the same time, in my own sense of justice, I don't know what it's like to be so desperate that you're trying to get a minimum paying job in order to feed your kids. So is my sense of justice alive? Or is my sense of loving mercy alive? It tests me every day because I go up on one side and I go down on the other. So the only thing I can do, and I hope only thing that all of us here can do, is, as Jesus says, pray always and don't lose heart. For what we do here today makes tomorrow possible for some people that we don't even know. And the great difficulty is when we pray every Sunday here, we pray for justice, we pray for mercy in the world. And tomorrow you may see just the opposite happening. And he simply says, don't be discouraged. Because when you pray to me,